once a year to celebrate the legacy of our great 40th President, Ronald Reagan. It's hard to believe that it's been almost 40 years since he was our Commander-in-Chief. And some of you may be asking yourself, I wonder what Ronald Reagan was doing 40 years ago on March 13 of 1986. Fortunately, I happen to have his daily calendar, fresh from the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. And ladies and gentlemen, it is fascinating. First, on March 13, 1986, President Reagan began the day at 7:35 a.m. having breakfast with Nancy. That's not surprising. He actually ended the day at 7 p.m. having dinner with the First Lady, Nancy Reagan. He had lunch that day with his Vice President, George Bush. And I won't bore you with what they talked about, but what's fascinating is what Ronald Reagan was doing in the morning and in the afternoon. In the morning, he gathered with his staff, and they were discussing how to depose a socialist dictator in Latin America. It wasn't Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. It was Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. And then in the afternoon, he and his Treasury Secretary, Don Regan, and other staff members at 2:10 were discussing the price of oil and its effect on our economy. And here we are 40 years later, talking about almost the same things with another leader, President Trump. And one of the things that we all take away from President Reagan is that he was such a great leader. And we have another leader among us here tonight. And all of you are familiar with her legislative accomplishments in the state Senate and in both houses of the U.S. Congress. But what's less known is how much Senator Marsha Blackburn knows about our judicial branch and about what a great executive she'll be appointing our Supreme Court justices. In 2020, she almost single-handedly was responsible for appointing an amazing federal judge in Knoxville, Katie Chrysler. And as you all remember, in 2022, she was center stage at a Senate Judiciary Committee nomination hearing, and before her was a candidate for the U.S. Supreme Court named Ketanji Brown Jackson. Do you remember the question she asked? She asked this candidate for the U.S. Supreme Court what she would use to define the term woman. And obviously, Ketanji Brown Jackson couldn't do it. And Senator Blackburn completed the most amazing takedown of any candidate for the U.S. Supreme Court in American history. And her inescapable point was that how can you possibly put on the U.S. Supreme Court to interpret the U.S. Constitution someone who cannot even define the term woman? That is the kind of leader and that kind of leadership that we want here in the state of Tennessee. And I am so grateful to be able to call Senator Blackburn a friend, a constituent, and the next governor of the great state of Tennessee.